Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank you and the staff for recalling Parliament for today's debate. Before I get to the urgent issue at hand, let me join you, Mr Speaker, and the Prime Minister in condemning the appalling shootings in Plymouth last week. We all send our condolences to the bereaved families. We must resolve to ensure that firearms do not get into the hands of dangerous people, and finally to get to grips with the way that hate thrives on the internet. Turning to Afghanistan, Mr Speaker, it's been a disastrous week, an unfolding tragedy. 20 years ago, the Taliban were largely in control of Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda were using the country as a training ground and a base for terror, including plotting the horrific 9/11 attack. There were widespread human rights abuses. Girls were denied an education. Women couldn't work. Being gay was punishable by death, all imposed without democracy. Since then, a fragile democracy emerged. Mr Speaker, it was by no means perfect, but no international terrorist attacks have been mounted from Afghanistan in that period. Women have gained liberty and one office. Schools and clinics have been built, and Afghans have allowed themselves to dream of a better future. Mr Speaker, those achievements were born of sacrifice. Sacrifice by the Afghan people, who bravely fought alongside their NATO allies, and British sacrifice. Over 150,000 UK personnel have served in Afghanistan, including members across this House, including the honourable and gallant members for Tunbridge and Moling, for Barnsley Central, Plymouth Moorview, Norwich South, Aldershot, the Isle of Wight, Filton and Bradley Stoke, and Wells. They and the tens of thousands of others deployed in Afghanistan served in difficult and challenging circumstances. And the Labour Party, and I'm sure everybody across this House, thanks each and every one of them, of the 150,000. Many returned with life-changing injuries, and tragically, 457 didn't return at all. I'll just make progress and then I will.
Later today, I'll be attending the service at RAF Lynham, outside Rolwyn Bassett, to commemorate the 10th anniversary, which falls today, of the last repatriation through Bassett. Will the right honourable gentleman agree with me that the message to those people that I will see today must be not that these young lives were wasted, but that they played an absolutely essential role in deterring and destroying terrorism and carrying out so many other good works in Afghanistan?
Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree with that, and will address it in just one moment. Thank you. Mr Speaker, for many of those who return from Afghanistan and other places around the world, mental health has been an all-too-familiar issue raised by veterans time and again, and the events of the last few days and weeks will have exacerbated the situation, reopening old wounds, and everybody across this House will have had examples of that. So we must improve mental health services for our veterans. Mr Speaker, in addressing the very point that's just been made, I want to address directly all those who served in Afghanistan and their families, especially the families of those who were lost. Your sacrifice was not in vain. Your sacrifice was not in vain. You brought stability, reduced the terrorist threat, and enabled progress. We are all proud of what you did. Your sacrifice deserves better than this, and so do the Afghan people. Mr Speaker, there's been a major miscalculation of the resilience of the Afghan forces and staggering complacency from our government about the Taliban threat. The result is that the Taliban are now back in control of Afghanistan. The gains made through 20 years of sacrifice hang precariously. Women and girls fear for their liberty. Afghan civilians are holding onto the undercarriage of NATO aircraft, literally clinging to departing hope. And we face new threats to our security and an appalling humanitarian crisis. I will.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for all the reasons he mentioned. Doesn't he agree that President Biden is actually wrong when he talks about American sacrifices in a civil war? The Taliban is not at war with a regime. The Taliban is at war with the civilised values of justice, equality and tolerance that all of us hold dear, and against which it respects no international boundaries.
I would agree with that intervention and thank the honourable member for it. Mr Speaker, I'll just make some progress and then I will, of course. Mr Speaker, the desperate situation requires leadership and for the Prime Minister to snap out of his complacency. The most urgent task is the protection of our diplomatic staff still working heroically in Kabul and the evacuation of British nationals and Afghans who've risked their lives. Mr Speaker, let me be clear, the Labour Party fully supports the deployment of troops to this end. We want it to succeed just as quickly and safely as possible. The Defence Secretary has said that some people who've worked with us will not get back. Unconscionable. The government, in one moment I will, the government must outline a plan to work with our allies to do everything that's possible to ensure that does not happen. Guarantee that our troops have the resources they need to carry out their mission effectively and as safely as possible, and work to provide stable security at the airport in Kabul so that flights can depart and visas can be processed. We all know how difficult that is. We all know how hard everybody is working on the ground, and we fully support it. And I raise an issue not by way of criticism, but just to get some reassurance, because there are reports this morning from NGOs that an evacuation plane left almost empty this morning because evacuees couldn't get to the airport to get to that plane. As I say, we are not challenging the work on the ground. We know how difficult it is, but at some appropriate moment I would like to see that addressed. If true. I will, yes.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Can I just bring him back to the statement by the President of the United States the other day? Does he not agree with me that this took on the terms, really, of a sort of shameful excuse? When he blames the Afghan armed forces, who have lost nearly 70,000 in trying to defend Afghan, when corruption had stripped away much of their pay, their money, their support, and the American decision to withdraw the aircraft cover was almost certainly going to lead us, does he not think that that is shameful?
Mr Speaker, the US is of course an important ally, but to overlook the fighting of the Afghan troops and forces in recent years, they have been at the forefront of that fighting, I think is wrong for any of us to overlook all the situation that they now find themselves in. Mr Speaker, the urgent task is of course the evacuation. Equally urgent is the immediate refugee crisis. I'll just make some progress and then I will. Many Afghans have bravely sought to rebuild their country. They did so on a promise of democratic freedoms, the rule of law, and liberty for the oppressed, including women and girls. They are our friends, and that was our promise. They are now fearing for their lives. We do not turn our backs on friends at their time of need. We owe an obligation to the people of Afghanistan. There should be a resettlement scheme for people to rebuild their lives here. Safe and legal routes. It must be a resettlement scheme that meets the scale of the enormous challenge. But what the government has announced this morning does not do that. It is vague. It will support just 5,000 in the first year, a number without rationale. Was that based on a risk assessment of those most at need, or was it plucked out of the air? Others, the offer to others in one moment, the offer to others is in the long term, But for those desperately needing our help now. There is no long term, Mr. Speaker. Just day-to-day survival. Yet again, this government... I will give way.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way, as well as the need for a much more bold and ambitious resettlement programme. Would he agree with me that this disaster must mark a turning point for our failed asylum system, in particular getting rid of the so-called hostile environment and the Nationality and Borders Bill, under which a woman fleeing the Taliban with her children on a boat across the Channel would be criminalised? Does he agree that that bill must now be revised?
Thank you for that intervention. I'm going to come on to the specifics of the system, because yet again this government seems ill-prepared and unwilling, just as it has been too slow to provide sanctuary to Afghans who've served alongside Britain. Too many reports of eligible Afghans facing bureaucratic hurdles and too many unfairly excluded. Mr. Speaker, knowing the date of withdrawal was coming for months, the Home Office is not close to completing the process they've already got up and running. It was designed to help 7,000 people, yet Home Office figures this week showed only 2,000 have been helped so far. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and the point that I wanted to make indeed to the Prime Minister was the situation facing Afghan Sikhs. Now, I know from my own constituency casework that there are Afghan Sikhs in the system at the moment waiting for clearance from the Home Office. So one of the things I would like to call on the government to do is to process those as quickly as possible and not leave all those people in the system waiting any longer than they have to at the moment. They are terrified with the idea of being sent back home, and despite the reassurance given to my honourable friend, I do not see any movement from the Home Office to give these people the legal status that they need.
I'm grateful for that intervention, and there have been other examples across the House of individuals and groups who are very obviously at risk in Afghanistan and need to come out just as quickly as possible. And that's, Mr. Speaker, where the question arises to what's behind the 5,000 number and why the others are having to wait so long. Mr. Speaker, the scale of the refugee crisis requires an international response, but we must lead it, and lead with a resettlement programme that meets the scale of the challenge. The scheme must be generous and welcoming. If it's not, we know the consequences. We know the consequences now. Violent reprisals in Afghanistan, people tragically fleeing into the arms of human traffickers. We know this is what will happen. More people risking and losing their lives on unsafe journeys, including across the English Channel. We cannot betray our friends. We must lead. I will.
For him giving way. He speaks of people fleeing, but what we have yet to assess is whether anyone outside of Kabul is able to get to somewhere of safety. Does he agree that now a safe corridor needs to be opened to an international border so that those who are not near Kabul can also get to safety via third countries?
Well, I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that intervention. And there is huge concern, as all members will know, about our line of sight beyond Kabul just at the moment. And again, that calls into question where the 5,000 number comes from, because we're not even in a position to assess at the moment the position outside of Kabul. We cannot betray our friends. We must lead. Mr. Speaker, I will.
The government of this kingdom to be overthrown by a wicked and brutal regime. I venture that he would want a leading role in the resistance. He wouldn't be queuing at the airport, would he?
When I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I had some of my prosecutors in Afghanistan at huge risk working on counter-terrorism with other brave souls there. So I won't take that from him or anybody else. Mr. Speaker, once these immediate challenges are addressed, we face an uncertain and difficult future. The Taliban are back in control, and we cannot be naive about the consequences. We've lost our primary source of leverage in political discussions, and everything we've achieved in the last 20 years is now under threat. I'm going to make some progress, and then I will give way. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right to say that we cannot allow Afghanistan to become a training ground for violent hate and terrorism. But that will be more difficult now that Afghanistan has descended into chaos. But if preventing al-Qaeda camps is now the limit of our ambition, we are betraying 20 years of sacrifice by our armed forces, and we're betraying the Afghan people who cannot be left to the cruelty of the Taliban. I will.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He speaks about the lack of ambition and the lack of urgency, which of course summarises everything about this government's approach to this crisis and many others. Isn't it telling about the whole approach of this government that when we had an Afghan government that we wanted to support, they should cut the amount of overseas aid we sent, and now the Taliban are in charge, they're talking about increasing the amount of overseas aid?
I'm grateful for that intervention. I'm going to come to the question of aid in just a minute, because it's a very important point in this context, looking at what has happened in recent weeks and months. I'm going to make some progress, and then I will make way. So we have to use every tool that remains at our disposal to protect human rights in Afghanistan. The government is right not to recognise the Taliban as the official government, and the Prime Minister has made that clear. But this must be part of a wider strategy developed with our UN security partners, our NATO allies, to apply pressure to the Taliban, not only to stamp out a resurgence of terror groups, but to retain the liberties and human rights of Afghans. We must work with Afghans' neighbours to ensure there is consistent pressure, and there must be a UN-backed plan to ensure our aid budget is used to support humanitarian causes in Afghanistan, not fund the Taliban. Mr. Speaker, this is a difficult task with no guarantee of success. So it should concern us all that the Prime Minister's judgment on Afghanistan has been appalling. Mr. Speaker, nobody believes that Britain and our allies could have remained in Afghanistan indefinitely, or that Britain could have fought alone. NATO leaders were put in a difficult position after President Trump agreed with the Taliban that all US forces would withdraw by May 2021. But, Mr. Speaker, that agreement was made in February 2020, 18 months ago. We've had 18 months to prepare and plan for the consequences of what followed, to plan and to prepare for the resettlement of refugees and those that have supported us, for supporting the Afghan government in managing withdrawal, for securing international and regional pressure on the Taliban and support for the Afghan government. The very problems we're confronting today in this debate were all known problems for the last 18 months, and there's been a failure of preparation. Mr. Speaker, the lack of planning is unforgivable, and the Prime Minister bears a heavy responsibility. Mr. Speaker, he mutters today. He was in a position to lead, but he didn't. Britain holds a seat at the United Nations Security Council. We're a key player within NATO. We're chair of the G7. Every one of these platforms could and should have been used to prepare for the withdrawal of forces, to rally international support behind a plan to stabilise Afghanistan through the process and keep us safe. I will give way in just a minute. But what did the... Mr. Speaker, did the Prime Minister use those platforms in those 18 months to prepare? No, he didn't. What did he do? What did he do instead? We debated this. He cut the development budget. He cut the development budget that was key to the strength and resilience of democracy in Afghanistan. He's making a great deal today of the money he's putting in. £292 million was spent in Afghanistan in 2019. In 2021, £155 million. Short-sighted, small-minded, and a threat to security. I will in a moment. I'm going to make this list. He failed to visit Afghanistan as Prime Minister, meaning that his last trip his last trip as Foreign Secretary in 2018 was not to learn or to push British interests, but to avoid a vote on Heathrow. Hundreds of thousands of British people have flown to Afghanistan to serve. The Prime Minister flew to avoid public service. Mr. Speaker, the list goes on. In March this year, the Prime Minister published an integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy. Huge review. He boasted that the review would, in his words, demonstrate to our allies in Europe and beyond that they can always count on the UK when it really matters. Well, the Afghan government was an ally, yet in the integrated review there were just 2 passing references to Afghanistan. 2 passing references. Mr. Speaker, the review didn't even mention the Taliban. It didn't even mention the Taliban. It didn't mention NATO withdrawal or the consequences of the Doha Agreement. It did cut the size of the army, and we did criticise it at the time. The very force that we're now relying on, eye off the ball, astonishingly careless.
You were probably on holiday.
The question is, why was the Prime Minister so careless? Why did he fail to lead? Mr. Speaker, it comes down to complacency and poor judgment. There was a calculation. I will in a moment. I'm going to make this case. There was a calculation that withdrawal would lead to military stalemate in Afghanistan and that stalemate would accelerate political discussions. Seeing this in July, members on both sides of this House warned the government, read Hansard, that they may be underestimating the threat of the Taliban. On both sides of the House, that point was made. That was ignored. And the government's preparation for withdrawal were based on a miscalculation of the resilience of the Afghan forces and a staggering complacency about the Taliban threat. The Prime Minister is as guilty as anyone. This Sunday, he said this, and I quote, "We've known for a long time that this was the way things were going." That's what he said on Sunday. That's not what he told this House. That's not what he told this House. In July, the Prime Minister stood there and assured members that there is no military path to victory for the Taliban. And then he went on to say, Mr. Speaker, "I do not think that the Taliban are capable of victory by military means." The British government were wrong and complacent, the Prime Minister was wrong and complacent, and when he wasn't rewriting history, the Prime Minister was displaying the same appalling judgment and complacency last week. Mr. Speaker, the response of the British ambassador to the Taliban arriving at the gates of Kabul was to personally process the paperwork for those that needed to flee. He is still there, and we thank him and his staff. The Prime Minister's response to the Taliban arriving at the gates of Kabul was to go on holiday. No sense of the gravity of the situation, not leadership to drive international efforts on the evacuation. The Foreign Secretary shakes his head. Mr. Speaker, what would I do differently? I wouldn't stay on holiday whilst Kabul was falling. And there are numerous examples of those leaders on both sides of the House who've come back immediately in a time of crisis. The Foreign Secretary stayed on his... He's shouting now. He's shouting now. Silent.
Order. The Prime Minister was heard, and I want to hear the Leader of the Opposition. I don't want people to say, you may disagree, but you'll also may wish to catch my eye. Don't ruin that chance. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary shouts now, but he stayed on holiday while our mission in Afghanistan was disintegrating. Mr. Speaker, he didn't even speak to ambassadors in the region as Kabul fell to the Taliban. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. You cannot coordinate an international response from the beach. A dereliction of duty by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, a government totally unprepared for the scenario that it had 18 months to prepare for. Mr. Speaker, it's one thing for people to lose trust in the Prime Minister at home, but when the trust in the word of our Prime Minister is questioned abroad, there are serious consequences for our safety and security at home. Mr. Speaker, in one moment, recent events in Afghanistan shame the West. Not just the scenes of chaos, but what it says about our abandonment of the Afghan people. For those brave people around the world, living under regimes paying scant regard to human rights, but resisting those regimes in pursuit of democracy, equality and individual freedom. What does this say to them? What does this retreat from freedom signal to those prepared to stand up for it? What does this surrender to extremism mean for those prepared to face it down? And what does it mean for those nations who support an international rules-based system when we hand over power to those who recognise no rules at all? That is the challenge of our time. Mr. Speaker, the British and Afghan people will have to live with the consequences of the Prime Minister's failure. We have fought for 20 years to rid Afghanistan of terror, terror which threatens our security here in Britain and liberty in Afghanistan. The Taliban are back in control. The Prime Minister has no plan how to handle the situation, just as he had no plan to prevent it. What we've won through 20 years of sacrifice could all be lost. That is the cost, Mr. Speaker, of careless leadership. Thank you.
Theresa May.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.